Over the past few years, I've covered a number of disappearances on this channel, each one tragic in its own way, but as I dig deeper into these cases, I've started to notice a troubling pattern that seems to point in the direction of organised crime. In cities across America, young girls of colour are vanishing at an alarming rate, and far too often, their cases receive little to no media attention, leaving their families understandably desperate for help. But what makes this pattern even more disturbing is the reoccurring context behind many of these disappearances, with one particular location seeming to stand out above the others, which would be Miami-Dade County, a region that has consistently ranked among the highest in the state of Florida for human trafficking reports. Year after year, young girls of colour are disproportionately represented in those numbers, suggesting that many of these missing person cases may not be isolated at all, but part of a much bigger, far more sinister problem. And while law enforcement insists that they are investigating these cases, the silence surrounding them, as well as the lack of concrete answers, has left many to wonder. Are we looking at runaway teens, or is there a deeper crisis unfolding just beneath the surface? So, in this video, rather than focusing on just one missing person case as I normally do, in order to get to the bottom of this mystery, I wanted to explore the possibility that these missing girls from Miami may be connected in some way. So with this in mind, let's get into the first case. On Tuesday, the 14th of February in 2023, a 15-year-old girl from Opa-locka, Florida, named Khamya Reddick, was last seen at her home in the Miami Gardens area before she would mysteriously vanish without a trace. Standing 5'4", weighing just 110 pounds, with brown eyes and black hair, Khamya was also known to have a distinctive tattoo in Arabic writing on her upper left chest, a detail that would later prove crucial for identification. But despite this, days began to pass with no sign of the teenager, and attempts to reach her went unanswered. So, with her family growing increasingly worried, they eventually reached out to law enforcement to file an official missing person report. Soon after, her photo and description were circulated through the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, as well as the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, who issued a statewide missing child alert. Flyers described her as possibly still being in the Miami area, but also suggested that she may have travelled as far as Texas. But despite their efforts, weeks would soon turn into months, and there was very little progress. In July of 2025, more than 2 years after she disappeared, the Miami Gardens Police Department reissued their appeal for information, once again asking the public for help in locating the now 18-year-old girl. But to this day, no confirmed sightings have been publicly reported, no abandoned belongings were found, no clear leads emerged, and no official suspects have ever been named. The trail simply went cold. However, what makes the case all the more settling is the context in which it occurred. Miami-Dade County continues to be one of the leading hotspots for human trafficking in Florida, with nearly half of all reported victims being minors. And given that Khamya was just 15 years old at the time of her disappearance, many believe that her case may fall into that category. And yet, despite the alarming statistics and the repeated pleas from her family, the disappearance of Khamya Reddick remains unsolved. So, as of today, more than 2 years later, her loved ones are still waiting for answers, and the community continues to wonder what really happened to this young girl. Because the one thing that is for certain is that Khamya Reddick has never been seen again. But thankfully, this isn't always the case when it comes to missing victims in Florida, as there are also numerous examples of girls who have gone missing for years after getting wrapped up in the underground practice of human trafficking, only to wind up being successfully located against all odds and brought to safety by the authorities. In January of 2024, Miami-Dade police made a shocking discovery that would bring one long-running missing person case to an end, while at the same time exposing just how easily vulnerable teenagers can be lured into the world of trafficking. The name of the victim has never been released publicly, both out of respect for her privacy and because media outlets almost always withhold the identities of underage victims in trafficking cases. But despite this lack of personal detail, the story itself is far too important to ignore. So her case began back in 2019, when a 17-year-old girl was reported missing by her family. At the time, she was still very young, and like many runaways, her sudden disappearance left loved ones clinging to hope but receiving very few answers. For nearly 5 years, there was no sign of her, no verified sightings, no confirmed leads, and no closure. Just like in the case of Khamya Reddick, her investigation went cold, and her name slowly faded from the public eye. But in early 2024, everything suddenly changed. Detectives with the Miami-Dade Police Human Trafficking Squad were scanning illicit escort ads online when one particular listing stood out. Among the staged photos was a face they remembered, which belonged to the very same girl who had been missing since 2019. So, recognizing the gravity of the situation, police quickly moved to arrange a recovery operation. Undercover detectives posed as clients, setting up a $500 date in Doral, and when the meeting time came, the girl arrived in a white Mercedes-Benz driven by a man later identified as 27-year-old Christian Manuel Carvajal. Once they were able to confidently identify the girl, officers immediately intervened, rescuing the teenager and arresting Carvajal without incident. For investigators, this case was both a disturbing confirmation of how traffickers operate and a rare success story in bringing a victim home alive. Detective Jessica Barriel of the Human Trafficking Squad explained that the girl had a long history of running away, often disappearing for stretches of time before resurfacing. This pattern of instability made her especially vulnerable to someone like Carvajal, who could exploit her need for money and freedom. Experts have also noted that South Florida has become a hotspot for trafficking, ranking 3rd in the nation for reported cases. Advocates warn that traffickers often use online platforms like Instagram to groom their victims, offering them gifts, secret cell phones, or promises of independence in order to gain control. Once trust is established, victims are quickly introduced to the business and pressured to hand over portions of their earnings. However, while Carvajal now faces serious charges and one teenager has finally been freed, the broader reality remains unsettling. For every recovery like this one, countless other missing children are still out there, hidden in plain sight, advertised online, and controlled by traffickers who thrive in the shadows. And in cities like Miami, where trafficking networks are entrenched and profitable, we have to ask the difficult question: how many of these so-called missing teenagers are not missing at all, but are instead trapped in a system designed to keep them invisible? Well, another example of this occurred back in March of 2023, when police in Miami Beach arrested a well-known physician, 68-year-old Dr. Jeffrey David Kamlet, after 2 missing teenage girls were traced back to his condominium. But little did anybody know at the time that this arrest would go on to spark one of the most high-profile trafficking cases in the city's recent history. It all began the previous summer, when a mother reported her 17-year-old daughter as missing, along with her daughter's 16-year-old friend. Using her phone's location, the mother tracked the signal to an upscale Miami Beach apartment building, which belonged to Dr. Kamlet, a man known for decades in the medical industry. When police arrived, Kamlet claimed that the girls had come there to escape a man who was allegedly trying to force them into prostitution. He also told detectives that the teenagers had presented themselves as 18-year-olds, but according to court filings later reported by NBC Miami and Local 10 News, the girls told a very different story. They described sexual encounters with Kamlet, payments for sex, and in one case, being provided illegal substances inside his home. As a result, prosecutors charged him with a long list of crimes, including human trafficking for commercial sexual activity, solicitation of a minor, unlawful sexual activity with a minor, delivery of a controlled substance to a child, and interference with custody of a child. But the situation was soon made even more tragic when just weeks before trial, in June of 2023, one of the alleged victims was found deceased in Miami's Little River neighborhood. So, with one victim out of the picture and the other unwilling to continue as a witness, the state attorney's office later admitted that they no longer had the evidence to prove the most serious charges beyond a reasonable doubt. So, in March of 2024, in a shocking turn, Dr. Kamlet accepted a plea deal. According to NBC Miami, 12 of the 13 original charges were dropped, and he pled guilty only to custodial interference. As part of the agreement, he surrendered his medical license and walked away from the far heavier trafficking and exploitation charges that once hung over him. So this case highlights a disturbing reality. that even when allegations of trafficking surface against high-profile figures, justice can falter if victims are unable to testify, or in this case, if tragedy strikes before trial. And for the families left behind, especially the mother who first traced her daughter's phone to Kamlet's condo, the reduced outcome of this case will always raise painful questions about how a story that began with such serious accusations could end with nothing more than a slap on the wrist. However, while it's true the Kamlet case revealed the shortcomings of the justice system, other operations in Miami show a very different side of the story, where investigators determined to intervene early have successfully uncovered trafficking rings through proactive stings and community-focused work, with the following story being a perfect example of this. On Thursday the 15th of July in 2021, detectives with Miami-Dade's Human Trafficking Task Force launched an operation targeting online sex ads they believed were linked to the exploitation of minors. What they uncovered was a disturbing reality hiding in plain sight: runaway teenagers being advertised on escort platforms, with their photos and ages manipulated to appear older, but in reality still very much underage. Within hours, undercover officers arranged meetings at local hotels, rescuing 2 girls, both of whom had been reported missing from neighbouring counties. According to a press release from the state attorney's office, one of the teens had been missing for over a month, and her family had feared that she'd fallen into the hands of traffickers, with those concerns tragically being proven correct. The following day, detectives arrested a 31-year-old man who was accused of transporting the girls across county lines and arranging their exploitation. Charges included human trafficking of a minor, deriving support from prostitution, and interference with custody. What made this case even more alarming was the method used by investigators to identify the girls. By cross-referencing online escort ads with missing person databases, they noticed physical similarities and unique identifiers, such as tattoos and jewelry, which allowed them to match the images with runaway reports. This practice has since become one of the task force's most effective tools in locating victims before it's too late. But this was not just an isolated operation. In fact, in 2022, another sweep by the task force conducted in collaboration with Homeland Security investigations led to the rescue of 4 other children. Through their investigations, they were able to learn that each victim had been lured through social media platforms, promised money, clothing, or simply a safe place to stay, only to be advertised online within days of going missing. Community advocates were quick to respond. Local non-profits in Miami immediately stepped in to provide housing, therapy, and legal advocacy for the rescued teens, while prosecutors worked to hold traffickers accountable. As the state attorney's office emphasized in their public statement, these rescues were only possible because of an ongoing collaboration between law enforcement, community organizations, and families willing to report when their children go missing. However, despite these many victories, the sheer number of cases highlights a grim reality: that traffickers in Miami continue to prey on the most vulnerable, especially runaways and children of colour, whose disappearances often go underreported. And while the task force has had success in dismantling individual operations, the systematic problem beneath it all continues to persist, leaving families in constant fear that their missing loved ones may not be safe, which is a situation far too familiar in the cases that we continue to cover on this channel. But if there is any kind of positive takeaway from all these stories, it's that when you look at them together, they reveal a tragic and urgent reality that too often goes ignored, which will hopefully bring a bit more attention to these stories. When young girls go missing in Miami, whether it's Khamya Reddick, a runaway lured into an online ad, or a minor trapped in a high-profile case like Dr. Kamlet's, there is a very real possibility that something nefarious has occurred. And yet, too often, law enforcement treats these cases as isolated incidents, or just assumes that the teens simply ran away, rather than immediately exploring the possibility of exploitation or trafficking. After all, the cases we've covered show a recurring pattern, where some victims are eventually rescued, some tragically have their lives taken, and others, like Khamya, remain missing to this day. And if we're honest, these outcomes point toward a broader system of exploitation that somehow thrives in plain sight. Unfortunately, the investigation process is often slowed by factors outside of the family's control. Witnesses may be traumatized, victims too young to testify, or in some situations, disappearances are dismissed based on assumptions tied to age, race, or socio-economic status. And in my opinion, this contributes to an injustice that is both systematic and deeply concerning. Now, just to be clear, I'm not saying that every police department in Florida is failing, but there is a noticeable pattern that when missing minors are Black or Latina, there is often an underlying assumption that they must have left voluntarily, and that presumption can cost precious time, which could be the difference between rescue or tragedy. So, until that systematic change happens, we all have to remain vigilant. Families, friends, and communities must continue to speak out, track vulnerable loved ones, and report suspicious activity immediately. And for those of you who are watching this video, remember, always let somebody know your plans, and recognise that even a seemingly small or spontaneous choice could place you in real danger. Because from what we've been able to ascertain through these stories, cases like Khamya Reddick's aren't just individual tragedies, they are part of a much larger story about vulnerability, exploitation, and the urgent need for awareness and action in both Miami and the wider United States. Anyway, with that, I think I'll leave this video here. But please let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if there are any other cases you would like me to cover. There were many more stories that I wanted to include in this video, so if you would like a follow-up, make sure to let me know in the comments and I can get a part 2 out next week. But until next time, thank you so much for watching, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss my next video. Also, if you found any of these cases interesting, feel free to check out the playlist on screen now, which details the many other cases of missing people across America who are still yet to be found.